Hi everybody, this is David Panush of the Edmund Burke School, and this is a video presentation for a Teachers Teaching Teachers faculty workshop, and the subject of this faculty workshop is feedback. So let's start off with this idea of feedback and what is the relationship between feedback and learning. So as anybody would probably just tell you just upon reflection, feedback is the fuel for learning. It is the way we learn naturally. It is the way organisms learn naturally through feedback loops, right? So something happens, it is successful or not successful that you try, and you realize in what way it was successful or not successful, and then you try and learn from that experience in some fashion. So one of the key ideas is that feedback is a loop, and if you're not doing it as a loop, then you're not really it's not going to be successful as a learning strategy. So another idea that'll kind of float along throughout this short presentation is the idea that I'm calling find the bug or find the error, which is the idea that, anytime you try something or attempt something, in order to improve the next time, you're going to have to know what you were not, where the bug was, where you went wrong, or what you need to leave out or what you need to add in. And that requires what researchers will call the assignment of credit problem, which is like, but they don't mean good credit, they mean credit or fault. So I thought it'd just be easier to call it find the bug. You got to be able to find the bug in order to do better the next time. And if you don't find the bug, you really don't have much hope of doing better the next time. You will repeat your mistake, right? And so, right, the definition of insanity, right? Repeating the same thing, expecting different results. If you don't know what you did wrong or what you need to do more of or less of, you're going to do the same thing. So feedback as an effect on learning is well researched. There's lots and lots of research that's been done about it. Some of sort of the biggest names in education have really focused on it. There's a gentleman by the name of John Hattie who does meta-analyses of meta-analyses, which is basically a fancy word for saying he keeps track of all the ongoing research on educational interventions, that is things that people do, and how they affect learning. And feedback consistently ranks near the top as an effect on learning, which certainly makes sense, but it's nice to know that it's backed up by research. Um, so, I like the quote from Jay McTeague, I never know how to say his name, who's famous for understanding by design. He says, going back to this idea of the loop, is that if you try and do learning without a chance for revision or a chance for a second try to do something with the feedback, just giving it but not actually doing anything with it, he's basically said it's like eating without digesting. I mean, another chance, right, which I think is just a memorable quote. So think of that. It's like eating without digesting is the idea that you try something, you get feedback, but you don't get a chance to do anything with that feedback. The learning will not take place in that case. The only important thing as we go through this entire presentation about feedback that you must keep in mind is that what are students doing with it? What are students doing with it? Other research has shown that in terms of the effect of feedback, there are a lot of different factors that might interact with how effective it is or on whom it is effective. And those things would be things that you would expect from your own experience and intuition, which is perhaps the nature of the assessment itself or the exercise itself suggests a certain type of feedback. The subject and content area can have an effect, the age or grade level of the student, the previous achievement levels of the student. So high achieving students generally tend to stay motivated even with negative feedback, and negative, lower achieving students in the previously lower achieving students tend to get very discouraged, so you have to be very much more careful. But you have the more opportunity to increase their motivation by giving them a chance to revise and a chance to improve. So that kind of relates to whether or not the student comes in with a growth or fixed mindset, which we can talk more about later. The quality of the feedback, we'll talk about that. And the interaction between grades and feedback and the systems that you've put in place, which may or may not undercut the ideas that you really want to move forward in terms of feedback. So let's talk about feedback as a recipe. This came from one of the resources that I'll share with you. And it's nice to have an acronym makes it easier to remember. So if you think of feedback as STUNNER, so feedback needs to be specific, timely, understandable, non-threatening, and there needs to be time for revision or reason to revise, repeat, redo, etc. I kind of came up with a bunch of different R's. But we're going to go into more detail about all of those things. But if it's easier to remember Stunner when you're thinking about how do I give feedback and construct feedback systems in my class, think of Stunner. So for my mind and way of thinking about this and the rest of this presentation, I thought it made sense to break up feedback into feedback content, that is the content of the feedback you give, and the systems that you put around the feedback. And that has more to do with what I was talking about a little bit on that first slide, which is opportunities to revise and motivating students and things like that. So when we talk about the content of the feedback, there's a spectrum of type of information we can give, right? We can give no feedback at all, or we can give too much feedback. And we have to be very careful about either of those things. For the you, the understandable part of the feedback, we could say something like, this was correct, and that, or we can say, this was wrong. Those are different types of feedback. We can say what you did that is wrong. That helps with that assignment of credit problem, where the bug is, what went wrong, where the specific discrepancy is. Then we can also give feedback that talks about how you will move, right? How you will move from what you did wrong to better. And that relates to some of these bullets below. So ego-focused feedback focuses on the individual. You did poorly, or compares them to other students. You're the worst student ever, or the best student ever, or you really have a knack for this. That's ego contents feedback. It is not generally, research shows, the best way to give feedback because it promotes a fixed mindset. Task-based feedback focuses on the student's actions or behaviors, doesn't compare them to other students, and not their abilities, which is seen as something intrinsic, but what their actions or behaviors, which is extrinsic, which means they can change it. Positive feedback says, keep doing this is great. Negative feedback says, stop doing this isn't good. Descriptive, so that goes to this, what you did wrong. Can I describe what you did? Prescriptive, that goes to how to do better. How can you get from your current state to your goal state? And evaluative feedback is also generally not as seen as well researched to support learning. So evaluative feedback is a grade, especially with no comments on it, or you did poorly or you did well. So that is not very helpful, research has shown. A couple other things in terms of the content of feedback. The content of your feedback must be given against the standard or criteria. So if you're supposed to be, there's natural feedback, like the standard for hitting a free throw is it goes in basketball, right? The standard for a computer science program is it works or doesn't work. But for other types of things, you have to have a rubric, and then the work that the student done is measured against it. And you have to say in your feedback, this is how you either met or didn't meet the standard. Understandable goes back to the you in Stunner. Motivating we'll talk more about, but obviously the words you use in the content of your feedback itself, right? There's research that shows that can either be motivating or unmotivating. Primarily, you have to show that you are going to be giving the student the emotional support that they need, that you believe that they can do better, and that they get a chance to do better. So that's going to be motivating. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So looking more at feedback systems, right? Going back to the most important thing, do you provide an opportunity and a reason to revise, right? There is no way that a student is going to take feedback from one assignment and use it on another assignment on their own, left to their own devices. They're going to move on with their lives. So if you are giving them a reason to revise, maybe they need to get better because this is a public product, right? I need to get better at my lines in the play because I'm going in front of people. I need to get better at free throw shooting because I need to make my free throws in the game. But you need to think about how you're giving them good reasons to revise, and of course the opportunity. Timing wise, if you give feedback too late, the student can't remember what they were doing or what they were thinking when they did the thing they did wrong. And that goes back to that assignment of credit problem. If you're saying I did this thing wrong, but it was like 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago or even 3 days ago sometimes, depending on the complexity of the task, I don't remember what I was thinking. What were you thinking? I don't remember. It's too long ago. Okay, so that's crucial to think about when you think about the timing. So The other thing that happens if you wait too long is they don't care anymore what your feedback is. So as far as too early goes, there's some kinds of mistakes that students are going to make that you want them to see the consequence of the mistake. What happens, what are the implications of making that error? If you stop them before they can see those natural implications, then they actually don't get a chance to learn from the natural feedback that they might get from the error being made. So you do have to think about that. Generally speaking, I think most of us, probably because we're busy, take too long rather than too early. We talked a little bit about this idea of motivation. So they have to have a reason to revise, and they have to believe in their efficacy. So you have to foster a growth mindset, right? So there's a study that was done that more or less said people, students got their feedback, and one condition, they said, I'm giving you this feedback because I believe that you can do better, and I'm going to help you. Something along those lines. And the resources are linked. But in that study, just putting those words on the feedback made it more effective because you're fostering a growth mindset. Otherwise, the student can't receive the feedback and won't want to do anything with it. There's obvious parallels here to the ideas behind mastery learning in case you're interested in learning more about that. The source of the feedback, it should not always be the teacher. And so you can think, what are some of the ways in which I can bring in outside experts or get peers to give feedback, or for the student themselves to give themselves feedback to begin to become aware of when they've done good work and not, or when they've measured up to the standard or not. That does take time, and novices aren't very good at it. But if you train them and they believe in it and the rubrics are clear, that can be done. You can also give them feedback on the process that they used, or the learning strategies, or their self-regulation, right? So it's not always on the quality of their work, but how they did the work, or how they got to that idea of doing the work. The rubrics and standards that you use, just like the feedback, should be understandable. They should be clear, effective, valid, appropriate, aligned. If you find that they're not, you might go back and say, my rubrics are not what they need to be for my feedback to be effective. So that's a feedback system. And similarly, you can't always give feedback on everything. So what kind of feedback are you giving, and is it appropriate for the context? Go back to some of those factors that I listed out at the beginning, like the age group or the type of assignment or things like that, to make sure, are you giving the appropriate feedback? I'll finish with this quote from Thomas Guskey, another sort of leading researcher and advocate for, in terms of this area of study in the ed world. Grades and feedback do not reflect who you are as a learner, but where you are in your learning journey. And where you are is always temporary. Comments that identify what students did well, what improvements they need to make, and how to make those improvements happen, provided with sensitivity to contextual elements, that's those factors, can guide students on their pathways to learning success and ensure that all learn excellently. I would add in his list of improvements they need to make, how to make those improvements, provided with sensitivity, with the opportunity to make those improvements. Okay? All right, so I'll leave you with that, and hopefully this has been informative, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thanks.